So the Mudroom is put together by a team of people. Also here helping introduce the storytellers is Alen Haenel. And she'll be emceeing the second half. I am right now, before we start, the first story of the second half is going to be a story picked from all of you. So if you have a story that fits the theme Under the Influence, write down your name, a short description of the story. It should be about a 7 to 10 minute story. And there's a basket in the other room, so put your name, short description of the story into the basket, and Leanne is going to pick a name out of that basket, and that person is going to tell the first story of the second half. And by the time you hear after you hear these first 3 stories, you'll be really inspired to tell your story. So you could start thinking about it, but listen to the stories. And also we would like, if you want to submit stories to the Mudroom, our next theme for the next storytelling is going to be What I Did for Money. It was going to be What I Did for Love, but we thought maybe people did really interesting things for money. Our first storyteller tonight is Brenda Danielson, and she's the director of the CREL, which is the Cold Regions Research Engineering Lab Child Development Center in Hanover, New Hampshire. And she has a story about being under the influence of her first real boss.
Hello. I think you can hear me. I graduated high school in the 70s in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. I was 18 and he was 81. I was a recent high school graduate and he was the senior member of a very well-respected law firm in the town. I was not privileged to leave for college immediately after high school. I had to earn money. And fortunately for me, I was hired as secretary to Harry Wellington Witters III. I realized many years later that the almost 2 years that I spent at that job ended up being not only the most important life lesson that I've learned, but the best education that I could ever have gotten. And I didn't realize it at the time, of course. He was hesitant, of course, to have this girl as his secretary. And that's what he called me, the girl. Can you imagine? Not today. And he would walk down the street every day. He was this figure that everyone could count on, with his New York Times and briefcase under one arm. He lived just at the end of the main street where our office was. And fresh flowers from his garden in his other hand. And he would climb up the stairs to the office, this really steep staircase, and catch his breath at the top of the stairs, and he would hand me the flowers. And you know, I did not come from a household who read the New York Times or put cut flowers on the table. So this was a new world for me. So I would arrange the flowers, and I just remember sitting at my desk with my IBM typewriter and my steno book, if you remember those, and my 2 resource books that I always relied on, the Legal Dictionary and Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Still rely on that. And those were my Bibles. He would dictate to me, and in shorthand, if any of you know shorthand, some legal terms and words are not easy to write in shorthand. And plus, I had never heard these words. What is a quit claim deed? It's a T, not a K. It's a quit claim deed. what is that? What is a warranty deed? Why are they different? What is a subpoena? Subpoena. I'd heard that word. I had never written it down. But okay, and when you put this into one of his documents or his letters, it needs to be perfect. And they did not have spell check or any other way to find out what these were. And so I did homework when I wasn't told to do homework. And I would research those words and make sure that they were perfect, if his signature was going on that document. And he respected me very quickly, maybe within a few weeks. He then asked me to go to his house to help him with some work. He hadn't opened his bank statements in a few months, okay? Like a year. And helping in his garden. And his magnificent house with, I had never eaten outside on a wraparound porch. Good food that he would prepare. It was also the summer of learning that I liked food. Because I had eaten for 18 years, but I never really cared about food. It was not interesting, it was not flavorful, it was just something that you did. You had to eat. But he loved food and he loved to cook. So, I would be putting his checks in order and he would cook dinner. Green beans that he would pick from the garden and bring in and steam. And as he would cook, he would talk about it and give you pointers. He probably realized that I had no idea. She is not going to appreciate this. Green beans with real butter, always real butter. I still use real butter, not margarine. And raspberry pie with cream that you whip yourself. It didn't come from a can. And coffee. Oh, he was a big, big coffee guy. Don't put anything in coffee. It wrecks it. If you drink coffee for 1 week and put nothing in it, you will never put anything in your coffee again. And that's true. I didn't, and I don't. My grown children can attest to that. They all failed the test because they thought that after a week. But it sticks. Roast beef needs to be rare. I had never eaten foods that anyone talked about or showed you how to cook. And the other big revelation that summer was that I realized why it was my mother was a horrible cook. Simple reason that I didn't like food. But all of those little pointers, stuck with me. And the respect that he showed for his clients also. In the Northeast Kingdom, sort of the Upper Valley, but the range was the farmer whose son had a DWI and he had no money and he didn't know how to do this in court. Or, up to the landowner with acres and acres of land planning his estate. Every single client was treated with the same respect. And watching that over those 2 years, just somehow, no one said, Brenda, remember to always respect people. It just stuck with me. And in the winter, he started to lose his memory, or he was failing, and it was making him really upset. And he would dictate letters to me, and I would wait for the next sentence, and he'd say, I'll do it tomorrow. Like, okay. And in the spring, he was dictating a letter to me, and he stopped and said, I need to ask you a favor. I'm like, oh, me? He said, girl. I think he said my girl, I'm not sure. I need to ask you a favor. You need to be my guardian. And I thought, oh dear, is this a legal thing? He said, no, of my words. He said, I'm not as sharp as I used to be, sadly. And if I say something to you to write this down and it doesn't make any sense to you, it probably doesn't. And so please call it to my attention. And then he just moved on, and I said, okay. And so for the next year, I was the guardian of his words. But I never, ever forgot him telling me that I was smart. You're a very smart girl, and you have common sense. Thank you. It was, other adults had given me praise and encouraged me, but that one encouragement and that one trust that he put in me just set a foundation that stayed with me forever. And I teach now, and I train a lot of young teachers, and my grown children can attest to the fact that, a lot of those little bullet items that he dropped over the years, I still bring forward. Look people in the eye when you talk to them. Never smoke. I never have. Never put anything in your coffee. That was one of the biggest ones. Don't rent, buy a house. Rent is a waste of money. And so I can only hope, at 81, if I make it to 81, that I will have the presence of mind to not only remember to tell young people when they're really smart and they have common sense, and trust them with my words, and ask for help if I really need it. Thank you.
Our next storyteller is Christina Phillips, and she's a producer for The Exchange on New Hampshire Public Radio. And she has a story about being under the influence of her mother, but she said, don't worry, it's not as bad as that sounds. And there's someone who looks suspiciously like her mother in the audience tonight.
So I woke up to the sound of coughing, and it was 4 a.m. on New Year's Eve, 2018. I was at my mother's house with my younger sister because both of them had developed these terrible upper respiratory infection, and, like, Happy New Year, I'll take care of you and, like, do your laundry or whatever. So I go into my sister's room, and I can tell right away that things are a little bit more serious than I was hoping. And she's sitting on the bed, and she has her arms up by her head, and her face is completely white, and she just cannot get a full breath in without immediately coughing it back out. And so pretty quickly I realize that she's in the beginning of what looks like a really serious asthma attack. And so my mom, who's also sick, is sitting there in the bed, and she looks at me and she goes, "What do we do?" Now, if we take a step back a little bit, one time my mom was perusing my sister's medical file for some reason, I don't know, and she found this note that said, "Mother is hyperattentive." And so my sister, who's 2 years younger than me, was born with a rare developmental disability, so rare, in fact, that at the time, medical schools taught that this kind of disability was incompatible with life. So Ashley was kind of one of a kind. Nobody really knew what her health issues would be and, what to expect from her. And so my mom realized pretty quickly that she was like kind of the expert on Ashley. And so a really good example of this is when Ashley was headed to preschool, she wasn't talking yet. And so the general consensus was, well, maybe she'll never talk. She might just be nonverbal. And my mom was like, "Have we checked her hearing before? Because I think that maybe she's hard of hearing, and maybe she's not talking because she can't hear anything." And apparently this had never occurred to anyone else, so they got her hearing tested, and lo and behold, she was very hard of hearing. And so within a year of getting hearing aids, she started talking and pretty much didn't shut up since. And then, a few years later, she had been, since she was an infant, she would get pneumonia like 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a year, and nobody could figure out why she was getting pneumonia. But my mom also noticed that she didn't seem to eat her food really well, and sometimes she would eat something and it seemed to go down the wrong way, and she would choke really badly. And a couple of those times, the next day, a day after, she was developing pneumonia. And so she brought it up with the doctor, was like, "Yeah, these things are related." And so they did a swallow study, and turns out that that was exactly what was happening. She had not really had well-developed swallowing muscles, so when she ate crumbly foods like cornbread, which, of course she loved, so it's going to be the thing that was wrecking her, so she would inhale it instead of eating it and then get pneumonia. And so pretty big fix, but you just change her diet. And she went from having pneumonia 3 or 4 times a year to not having it for 3 or 4 years at a time. And so as a kid, I was only 2 years older than Ashley, and so I kind of was absorbing all of this implicitly, and I didn't really realize how much it influenced me until my mom got sick when I was 18. So to make a very long, very complicated illness very simple, she was born with a rare, undiagnosed birth defect in her pancreas. And that eventually turned into what is called chronic neuropathic pain in her abdomen. And of course, rare, sound familiar. Nobody really knew what to do with it. And it took a really long time to kind of figure out how to treat her. And so essentially what it looks like is on any given day, she might have pain that's, like between a 1 and a 5 on that 1 to 10 pain scale. And you can manage that with pain medication, electrotherapy, that kind of thing. But every once in a while, she has these like flare-ups where the pain is 10 out of 10. And she can't eat, she can't drink, she's throwing up, and we figured out that the only way to really kind of get her body back to normal is to admit her to the hospital for a few days with IV fluids and really aggressive pain management. And so all this time, I was 18 to 27, basically watching her figure these things out and going through this. And I noticed that it seemed like the biggest problem was it was really hard to get doctors on the same page as her. And I was like, that seems kind of familiar. And I sort of was like, oh, I get it. Like, she needs what she was to Ashley. Like, she kind of needs that for herself, especially when she's sick and she's in pain and doesn't really, want to communicate with anybody. And so I sort of became, hyper attentive daughter. So, when she would have these flare-ups, I would drive her from Nashua, from our house in Nashua, up to Dartmouth, because of course, in order to get into the hospital, you have to go through the ER, which is like the worst thing ever. And at least at Dartmouth, that was where her pain team was. So I knew that if I got her into the hospital there was somebody there who knew what to do. And so we'd go to Dartmouth, she'd get admitted. And then I'd practice so many times explaining what was wrong with her to doctors that I had basically gotten down to a 2-minute elevator pitch. And so the nurse would come in, I'd be like, hi, I'm Christina, here we go. I'm gonna break it down for you. This is what she needs, this is what doesn't work. She's allergic to this. Oh, by the way, she has the veins of a 95-year-old woman, so you might want to start sticking her now. Try the left arm, And so I really kind of honed this skill, taking care of my mom. And so this night, this past New Year's Eve, when Ashley was having this asthma attack, and when she looked at me and said, what do I do? It wasn't that she didn't know what to do, she knew what needed to happen. But she knew, and I also knew, that she was not the best person to take care of Ashley in that moment, because she was also sick and she wasn't feeling right. And so I was like, oh yeah, okay, I got this, I know she's got an emergency inhaler, so I'm going to go get her emergency inhaler, but I know it's not going to be enough. So I called 911, and I'm giving her the inhaler while I'm on the phone with 911, and then I know that they're not going to be able to find our apartment because they can never find it. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go outside. I'll wait for the ambulance. You guys stay here. And I'm standing outside in my pajamas, and it's 2 degrees, and I had, about 30 seconds where I was feeling things. And so I cried for 30 seconds, and I was like, okay, got it. I'm all good. So the EMTs get there, and within 10 minutes of giving her this nebulizer treatment, my sister, to get her asthma under control, she's sitting there with her little mask on, and she's looking at the EMTs and winking and trying to give them hugs. And so it's okay. So I'm sort of feeling like I'm either going to start bawling or laughing, or maybe a combination of both. But all of this is to say I was able to handle that situation, and I don't think I ever would have been able to handle it if I hadn't kind of had this grown up looking at my mom the way that I did, and then also taking care of her. And so, there's a lot of ways that your parents can influence you, and I think my mom has a lot of guilt about how much of a caretaker I had to be for her. And what I have to say to that is that there's a lot of things that I do in my daily life, especially as I get older, where I stop and I'm like, oh God, I am just like my mom, like not in a good way, where I'm like, I told myself I would never do these things, but it turns out this is what I'm gonna do now. But that whole like hyper attentive caretaker thing, I'm pretty proud of that one. Thanks.
We have one more storyteller in this half, and remember, we're going to have a little break. You can listen to some music, maybe eat a little more, have a little more food, and put your name into the basket so you can possibly be selected to tell a story in the second half. And also, for if you're thinking about pitching a story to tell at the Mudroom, you can do that online, and we do actually all meet before the Mudroom. All the storytellers are given the opportunity to come up, and everyone tells each other their stories, and everyone coaches each other. And it makes everyone a lot less nervous, and it helps you refine your story a little bit. Viki Bridge was, I got to hear her story a couple days ago, and she is a librarian with a passion for travel. She has lived and worked in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Newport, New Hampshire. And she has a very unlibrarian-like story to tell about being under the influence of the good stuff.
So I did my undergraduate work at UNH in the early 80s, which turned out to be a very long and expensive party. So this event takes place in the spring of my freshman year. And I don't know if they still do this at UNH, but at the time, the fraternities would have what they called ladies' teas. And this was a Thursday night event where only girls could go, and they would serve keg beer and fruit punch, which was really just cheap vodka and Hawaiian sea powder, so it was pretty strong. So anyway, we would get ready for ladies' tea. We'd all come back from our classes at 3 o'clock and watch General Hospital together, have a couple of beers, and go eat dinner, and we'd come back and we'd pretty ourselves up and we'd head out to the ladies' teas. For this tea, I had a friend visiting me from high school. And we went over to one of the fraternities. I don't remember the name of which one it was now, but it was one of them. And so you go into the ladies' tea, and it's a room full of young women and fraternity brothers, and no other guys were allowed to come. So it was only the brothers for that house could be at this tea. So it was, as I said, lots of beer, lots of punch, which that punch made for a really interesting effect when girls would go out and throw up their dinner in the snowbank. And it was for these guys, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. There was just, yeah. So I'd been to enough ladies' teas to know that the good stuff was upstairs. And this was a time of Coke, and the pot was upstairs, and if you could get yourself invited upstairs, that was the goal. So Deb and I got invited upstairs, and we went into this room, and lots of people there, and I sat. She went off to the other side of the room, but I sat on the arm of the couch that was kind of near the door. And not too long, this guy came over and gave me a joint. So I took a good hit and passed it on, and I thought, this isn't right. Something's not right here. And it didn't take me very long to realize that there was more than just pot in that joint. The sound sort of started going in and out, and the rooms got long, and things were kind of moving in slow motion. It was very strange. And this guy came from my left side, and he pushed me down onto the couch, and he was pulling my shirt off and pulling my jeans, and I thought, oh, you know, slow motion going on here. I think I'm being assaulted. And then the gas that I had been holding in, struggling to hold in all that evening, burst out. It was a very, very loud fart. And the guy just sort of went like this. And heads turned in the room, and people were looking at what was going on. And Deb saw what was happening, and she came and she grabbed my hand and she pulled me out of that room, and she pulled me out of that frat house and took me back to my dorm. I don't know what was in the joint. It took me 3 days to sober up. And I was thinking it was around the time of angel dust, so maybe that was it, I don't know. But I never told this story to anybody because it was so embarrassing. Until my daughter was getting ready to go off to college. And I thought, I really need to tell her this story. So I told her the story, and we had a good laugh, and off she went to college. And then one evening, really late, like 10, 11 o'clock at night, I get a text on my phone, and it says, "Mom, a guy just gave me a drink, and I waited till he looked away, and I put it down." So I'm just so glad that I could be an influence for her.
Okay. So, you know, Mike mentioned before that when people submit a story for our regular mudroom, and I'll just give you a little bit of information, we ask people to write a pitch, kind of a paragraph or so. And then based on reading a paragraph, we make selections. It's pretty difficult to know how is that story going to be told and what's it going to feel like. But we do the best we can. I mean, we've had some other ways of submitting, but that's what we usually do, and we choose storytellers for the event. Invariably, someone is sick, someone can't come, we punt at the last minute. But we have a rehearsal, and the rehearsal is 6 or 7 of us, and we just tell the story, and there's some comments and questions and workshopping. And as Mike said, so that helps people feel less nervous. But tonight we have some brave people who, with no rehearsal and absolutely no practice, or maybe they've been home practicing all night, I don't know, have put their names in the hat for a story. And tonight, our storyteller is going to be Chris Cassel? Cassel, telling a story under the influence of conversational English.
So perhaps you already know that this is going to be a Peace Corps story. I served in Armenia from 1997 to 1999, and this is a very interesting time in this former Soviet Union because they'd been about 5-6 years out of the Soviet Union's influence and an independent republic again. And I had been there working, and I needed a vacation. Very important. So I said, well, where does one go? I've been in a landlocked country for a year and a half. I'm ready. I need to go to the ocean. And so that's what I did. And I got on a bus in Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, for those who know. And I sat on the bus for a while because it wasn't going anywhere. And then I realized that I hadn't spoken English in a very long time. And finally, I saw why we hadn't been moving, because Öcalan, the Kurdish resistance leader, had been arrested that day in Turkey, and Armenians were protesting, and they had signs and posters, and I said, I'm never going to get out of here. But we left. thankfully, because I had gotten to that point in a Peace Corps stay where you go, I cannot do this anymore. I've got to get out of here. That's sort of. And I hadn't heard English in a long time because I was so immersed in the culture and speaking the language and I'd forgotten my own voice. And so the bus was slow, but it got me out of the country, and I ended up in Georgia because Turkey and Armenia don't have a border passage anymore, for reasons many know. So I got to the Georgian border at 8:45 p.m. after a very long day. And the border guard greeted me and he said, "We're closed." My vacation, visions of the ocean were drifting away at this point, and I was just saddened. And I said, and then I just said, trying to make conversation, I said, do you play backgammon? Under the influence of Peace Corps, right? We're trying to, and I said, and I can help you with your English. So we played backgammon from about 10 of 9 until about 10 of 10. And on my way. So, and I threw in, Armenians and Turks actually get along beautifully in reality, and the one you roll dice in Armenian backgammon, sheshubesh, you actually say the numbers in Turkish, which was helpful in making new friends and influencing people. So I get to, and the border guard even offers to drive me to the nearest hotel, because it's the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, and the smallest border crossing. But he's a little bit concerned, because Öcalan was arrested that morning, and my passport says humanitarian assistance worker. So they're wondering, what am I doing on this small border crossing trying to get into the country the day that Öcalan was arrested with a Peace Corps worker visa in there and American passport. So I go to bed, and about an hour later at 10 of 11, there's a knock at the door at this very strange little hotel that I've only not even seen in the daylight, and I'm boarding a bus, and they assured that I'm boarding a bus and I'm traveling all the way across Turkey. And I go to the door, and it's a very inebriated chief of police and his son, who wants to speak conversational English. I said, I'm sorry, I don't give lessons at almost midnight. I can't help you. So with that tense moment past, I get a fitful night of sleep, and then the next morning I get on the bus and I'm off, finally, towards the ocean, but still very much under the influence of conversational English and the Peace Corps, of course. So I travel all this way, and I get to the ocean and Trabzon and all these places. It's a massive blizzard, and finally I get there to the coast, and the ocean is beckoning me, and it's beautiful, and I have the most amazing hammam, which is the Turkish bath, and I'm totally relaxed, and a guy turns to me in the bath, and he's like, "Do you speak conversational English?" I said, "Well, actually, yeah, I do. I'm an American." And so he wants to talk, and he said, "I'm a teacher at the school, you should come and you can talk and we can do some conversational English." And I said, "Okay, great. I'm on vacation." I didn't say that to him, but so I agree to go to the school and to talk to his class. Well, I get to the school, and my dreams of speaking conversational English to a young class of Turks vanishes, because I need to see the guidance counselor before I'm allowed to speak to the class. They're concerned that I might say something about the genocide and the relationships between these two countries, which are very tortured and sad and reflective of our times. But anyhow, I won't digress. And so my effort to do a little bit of community service on my vacation was scuttled. And I just said, I need to just be on vacation. And so I walk out the door, very discouraged, but anyway. And on my way out, an older man says to me, "Conversational English?" And he and I had a beautiful connection, and he sits me in his car and he goes, "Where are you going? Let me take you. I learned conversational English from a Peace Corps volunteer." Just like you. 35 years ago, and we had the most wonderful time, and we had a beautiful meal on the shores of the sea, of the ocean, as we toasted and drank and spoke conversational English.
Thank you. See, anyone can do it. Our next storyteller is Linda Harvey, who is also going to tell us the story of being under the influence of her mother, but in a slightly different way than the story we heard earlier.
Hi. This has nothing to do with being under the influence. So this story is from the day September 15th, 1985. I leave this message on my friend Jody's brand new answering machine. Hi, meet me at the Ritz at 6:30 for martinis. It's my mother's birthday. So, just to give a little background, Jody and I went to high school together in Illinois, and we reunited after me spending time in Vermont at our 10th year high school reunion. I flirted with Bill Wilde, hoping he would ask me to marry him so I could be Mrs. Wilde. And under the disco ball, she convinced me I needed to get out of the suburbs and move into the city. I knew she would know to wear a black cocktail dress and high heels. I invited 2 other friends. They were excited to have mid-week cocktails, but promised to dress up a little bit. So I get to the Ritz. I'd never been there. I'm walking on the marble floor, and I hear my not quite graceful walk in high heels that I'm not used to. And I think about my mother with her long legs, her hips sashaying, and I'm so envious of her and my taller sisters. I get to the bar, and it's a place my mother would have loved. Low lights, jazz playing, the polished oak bar, and I find the leather booth to sit in, and I wait. I hear people coming, laughing, my friends. They join me, and I beckon the bartender over to order martinis. They were my mother's favorite drink. So we order the martinis. They come. I raise my glass and say, "Happy birthday, Marie Joyce." She would have been 50 years old. And I took the sip, cold, clear, pine needle liquor. I hated, even though it had extra olives, because it was the 80s. I was used to drinking Long Island iced teas. So I raise the glass again and I say, my mother gave me advice about a lot of things, but one thing she told me to remember was that martinis are like women's breasts. 1 is not enough, and 3 are too many. And so I have still remembered that. And so we drink, and I pull out of my purse some letters my mother had written to me. So my mother was diagnosed with cancer when she was 39. She was in Vermont to spend her last few months. I had stayed in Illinois, and so we wrote letters to each other. And so I told my friends, she loved to do art. She painted. This says #1 daughter. It's from the fall of 1975. And so I just read this little piece. Love is when you don't dream about it anymore. It's about some time a man treats you like a woman and not a pal. I only knew Herbie 11 days before I married him. If that means anything, yes, I loved him very much. So that's my father. She got married at 18, and she was left a widow by the time she was 19. So then she goes on. John Paul is the love that is strong, love like a rock, and more than that, a love that is here and now and at this moment, and at 40, honey, you got to give more on both sides, man and woman alike. So at this point, we're probably ready for another drink. I decide to have another martini, why not? Liz joins me, Jody has wine, Susan has water. So I said, okay, Jody said, why don't you read a little bit more? So you have to remember, we're women in our 20s, late 20s, and we're clueless. So I have this letter, this is the screen paper, this is very unusual. It was usually she borrowed 3-ring binder paper from my younger brothers and sisters as they were doing their homework. And so she's referring to a man, Jerry. One of the things that was on my to-do list when my mother left Illinois, I was still there, was to lose my virginity. Because I knew if I walked in the house, she would have known that I had slept with someone. And so Jerry's the lucky guy. And so I, of course, am writing to her, I know you must love Jerry very much. You have to really take yourself aside and look into your own self and feelings and be honest with yourself. Your body and your mind and feelings will always be with you all your life. I don't really worry about you. You are okay. Be happy. Be your own self. So I then realized that my mother gave different advice to my friends and to my sister. My sister said she could not make Jell-O. And my mother said, Kathleen, you better be good in bed, because you certainly can't cook. And then another friend had been visiting my friend from across the street, a very wonderful Lutheran girl. And my mother and John Paul come up the steps. John Paul is my stepfather, who was from Vermont, and that is how we got to Vermont. And Barbara looks at them and she said, my mom just said, oh, we always do this. We're just saving water. And then John Paul's advice to me was always, before I would go out with my wild group of friends, you better remember to keep your legs crossed. Which I guess I had. And so the night is going on. I'm about ready to just have maybe one more night to cap. And I said, okay, let me just read one more thing, because this is like the thing that I hope I never forget. So this is from March of 1976. Number 1, received your letter this morning. Glad you and Jerry had a long talk and a moment to put your feelings and hurts back into the open and into each other's arms. That's the way it has to be, or without that moment in life, you can lose yourself. You have to pull that chair out from under the table and stand on it. And if no one sees or hears you, you have to put that chair on top of the table. And without a doubt, you will be heard and understood, because you are, first of all, important to yourself. I think by that time, I was not counting, but I knew it was time to go home. So we went out into the streets of Chicago, and the autumn wind is blowing and the leaves are rustling, and I convinced my friends I'm okay, that I can get home. And I get home and I get back to my apartment, and I'm in my pajamas, and I look over, and there is the empty box. And I realize I left the letters at the bar. And so I'm like, shit. I find the number for the Ritz. I wait patiently for the rings. Finally, a man with a heavy accent answers, and I say, I've been there and I left some letters there. And he said, I see nothing here. And then he said, wait a minute, and he put the phone down, and I hear his footsteps leave and then come back. And he said, I found them. They're in the trash. They're all wet. I said, fine, I'll come and I'll pick them up tomorrow. It was like that, like a child that had lost the sight of her mother and then saw a flash of red pants that she had on. I sort of knew everything would be okay. So I go to the bar the next day. I'm a little embarrassed, a little shy, but very happy that bartender was not there. And so he slid the letters across, water stained but dry, and I was just so grateful to have them. Would you like a drink? You're pretty lucky. I said, no, I'm just really ready to go. So I get home, and I'm very happy about that. And I continued to drink martinis on my mother's birthday with vodka, dirty, extra olives. And this is the first time these letters have left my house. And I have to say that I have a son who's the age of that I am now that is asking me, what happened in my childhood and why am I the way that I am? And he has a girlfriend he wants me to meet, and I have some letters I might share with them.
Thank you, Linda. There's a lot of things to be under the influence of. Our last storyteller tonight is someone who has told stories here at the Mudroom before, and it's Alen Haenel, who is an English teacher at Hanover High School, and he has a different influence that he's going to share with us. Alen.
Good evening. I want to tell you about something that happened to my friend Jeff and me when we were 16 years old. But first, I need to give you a little context. A few years back, I had a German exchange student named Petra. And one day in class, the kids were asking her the typical question, so what are some of the differences between living in the United States versus living in Germany? And I will never forget Petra's answer because it was not typical at all. She didn't talk about differences in food or the school district. She talked about one word, love. L-O-V-E, love. You Americans love everything. And you say, I love you, to everybody. I love you, Dad. I love you, Mom. I love you, my BFF. I love you, even though I just met you 2 minutes ago. Now, I know that's a terrible German accent, but Petra's point was that in Germany, those were not easy words to say. They saved them for special occasions and special people. And I have to tell you, I loved what Petra was saying because I really related to that. Maybe it's because I'm of German descent. Haenel means roughly translated little rooster. Or maybe it's because I grew up in a typical tight-lipped New England home. But we just did not say those words. I could say that I loved my mother's spaghetti sauce, but to say to my mother, I love you, Mom, not so much. Never mind saying it to my dad, or my siblings, or my friends. No. I think I grew up in a loving environment, but I love you was something that was understood and not stated. Now, back to Jeff. Jeff and I were church buddies. We'd see each other generally twice a week, on Sundays for our regular church meetings, and then on Wednesdays for youth group. And Jeff was a big guy. He was probably 6'3", 240 pounds, and I was probably nowhere near that big. But despite the size difference, we were really best friends. And we related to each other like typical adolescent boys do. We drank a lot of tea, and we ate crumpets, and we discussed the finer points of Emily Bronte. No. I remember one Wednesday in particular, we got done with our religious instruction, and then we went out to play basketball, as we usually did. And it was more like basket brawl. I mean, blatant fouls were sort of the point of the whole game. Anyway, so we played basket brawl for about a half an hour, long enough to get really red-faced and sweaty and just gross. And then the girls came out of their meetings, and they reminded us that that week we were supposed to be practicing ballroom dancing with them. And they took one look at us and said, "Oh, we are not going to dance with you." And we very suavely said, "Oh, okay." And then the girl said, next week, do not dance or do not play basketball before you dance with us. Oh, okay. I mean, and that was us, Jeff and me. We were just like brawling, sweaty, gross, farting, teenage boy goofballs. Well, one Sunday, I went to church, and I heard some very disturbing news. We knew a boy who was of the same denomination we were, but went to a different branch of the church. He went to church over in Plattsburgh, New York, and we were up in South Royalton. And this boy's name was Mark. We'd see him about 4 times a year when we'd have these regional youth conferences. Well, what happened with Mark was that in Plattsburgh, New York, his church was putting on a spook alley. And Mark was supposed to be the hanging man. So you'd open the closet door and get this fright from seeing a man hanging by the neck. Unfortunately, tragically, something went very wrong in the closet because Mark somehow actually did hang himself to death. So this Sunday, we heard the news about Mark. And of course, it was terribly sad. Though we didn't know him very well, still death is hard, especially young death. But we had our youth leaders there, and we talked, and we cried, and we made some good progress processing Mark's death. Jeff was not there that Sunday. Jeff didn't find out about Mark's death until the next Wednesday. Now, what we didn't know was that Jeff and Mark were actually quite close. They visited each other between youth conferences. So to say that Mark was upset when we told him the news, or that Jeff was upset when we told him the news of Mark's death, was a huge understatement. He was beside himself. He didn't cry. He bawled. He screamed. He terrified us with the depth and breadth of his grief. And at one point, he ran out of the church building, out into the parking lot, and he jumped in his car. And we went running after him, but we were too late. He went screeching out of the parking lot. Jeff always drove too fast, but in this case, he was completely out of control. And everybody turned to me because I was his best friend, but I was saying, I don't know what to do. Are we supposed to try to chase after him in our cars? We have no idea where he went. So we stood there in the parking lot for a little while, and then Jeff finally came back. But when he returned, the side of his car was totally caved in from where he had sideswiped a tree. So when Jeff got out of that car, he was even in worse shape than when he got into it. Now, one thing that happened with Jeff, somehow, in his total unreasoning state of grief, is that he had decided that Mark did not deserve to die, but that he, Jeff, did. And he was insistent at this point that he needed to die. So here I was at the front of this small group of kids in the parking lot, standing in front of my friend Jeff, 6'3", 240 pounds, inconsolable, flailing, wailing, suicidal. And I had no idea what to do to help him. We knew that if Jeff decided to get back in that car and instead of sideswipe the next tree, just go 70 miles an hour straight on into it, there is nothing we could do. We knew that if we couldn't find a way to get through to Jeff, we were probably going to lose him. And that is when I came under the influence of something beyond me. Something I choose to call grace. Grace whispered in my ear what I needed to do. So I grabbed Jeff by the shoulders, and I looked him in the eye, and I said, Jeff, I love you. Now, I did not want to say it. I wanted to hide. I wanted to say, Jeff, you are loved. Or Jeff, God loves you. Or even, Jeff, we love you. But grace told me at that moment that what Jeff needed to hear was directly from me to him. And so I said, Jeff, I love you. And then I wrapped my arms around him and held on as tight as I could, which also was totally out of character for us. And it worked. He calmed down. We began to talk. He began to heal. I don't know where grace came from that October night. I don't know why she chose to visit us, but I am forever grateful that she did. Thank you.
Thank you, Alen. Thank you all for coming. The next Mudroom is June 13th, second Thursday of June, and the theme is under what I did for money. So be thinking. Thank you again for coming.